We looked at the range of views about Taiwanese indigenous peoples, noting that these Chinese views in particular tended to follow a particular kind of taxonomy that pivots on the view of human nature. Right? So that was, here it is again. While continuing to elaborate on this taxonomy in this lecture, we plan to both zoom out and zoom in. So we're going to step back from the Taiwan case for a moment to figure out the larger issues behind Qing and its use in imperial Chinese discourse, as well as zooming in to figure out how Qing works in and for particular cases or thinkers. So I think in the first lecture we kind of had a broad overview of examples. In this lecture we're going to drill down a bit more deeply into how the term is used in specific kinds of arguments. I will tell you this lecture is the least developed part of the project. I think it's the most exciting. It was the most exciting lecture for me to write because it was a lot of material I was bringing in that I've been reading and thinking about for a long time. But it also means that it's the least developed. So I'm hoping that you can, of course, help me work out some of these ideas, and I'm sure you will, as you did with the first lecture, point out all those places where I have omitted to be clear or comprehensive or precise. So I welcome. That's just to say that I welcome your comments. So although Qing has been shown, in my view, persuasively to form a central part of the discourse of colonial travelers and writers, right? So I mean, even people who, like Emma Dunn or Lawrence Thompson, who talked about other things in other ways, who I'm criticizing in a lot of this project, they use the word Qing. They recognize that it played a central part in the discourse of colonial travelers and writers. My argument in this lecture will not be empirical or historical, but rather conceptual. So this is in a way of responding to the question I got the last time about, are you doing history, are you doing philosophy? So my response is to say I'm doing something conceptual. I try to show how, in a wide variety of philosophical, literary, and other texts produced by Chinese thinkers throughout time, the idea of a shared human nature acts as a key index of the moral and political worth of perceived cultural others. And as such, is deployed as a justification for the transformation of those others to accord with the reigning standards and institutions of civilization. So I don't claim so much that Qing was the only concept available to Chinese writers encountering foreign otherness, but its discourse supported identical arguments throughout time. So this is a problem. Now I'm getting, did you just see my iMessage? It didn't come up. Okay, because my family is off in Heidelberg having a good time, and they're sending me all these pictures, but I don't, which is great, but like I'm in the middle of a lecture, I don't want them like all popping up, and this is me. Here's Heidelberg Castle. I don't know what happened. If it does happen, just please somebody tell me. So I don't know how to shut it off, but if it didn't show, it's fine. So I don't claim that Qing was the only concept available, that its discourse supported identical arguments throughout time, or that its invocation stands as a causal explanation for the territorial expansion of any particular Chinese dynasty. So I'm distancing myself from causal claim. I'm not saying that because Qing, then these things happen. But I do argue that it played a distinctive and load-bearing role in the articulation of hierarchies of difference between so-called Chinese and barbarian types throughout imperial Chinese discourse, as well as how such hierarchies of difference were marshaled to support or explain certain kinds of policies or institutions on the dynastic frontiers. Now, you will recall in the first lecture about mentioned sprouts of human goodness, you remember the image of the chocolate bell, etc. We might summarize Mencius's argument about this as he does in 686 in his argument about He says, quote, "What I mean by saying human nature is good is that there is that in our nature which is spontaneously part of us and can become good. The fact that we can become bad is not a defect in our natural endowment." We mentioned this in the seminar. Mencius does not deny, of course, that differences in endowment do make a difference to social functioning. In an exchange with the agriculturalist Jenco, who advocated a political order in which everyone participated equally on the basis of the claim that some people, everyone participated equally in producing food and other necessities. Mencius defends the division of labor in society on the basis of the claim that some people labor with their hands or their strength, while others labor with their minds. This is in 3A4. I don't believe that I assigned this passage as a primary material, but it's there if you want to look at it. Nevertheless, many have seen Mencius's principal defense of the goodness of Qing as entailing a deeply egalitarian political implication, namely that the doctrine of innate goodness potentially undermines certain forms of autocratic authority. Those of you familiar with contemporary Confucian philosophy, or what's called New Confucianism, as opposed to Neo-Confucianism, will find this claim repeated quite a bit, but Bai Tong or Stephen Angle, and I think even Joseph Chan. So there's a wellspring of kind of current scholarship. She's in Mencius a claim about egalitarian political participation. But nevertheless, given that Mencius does say things in 687, he says the sage and me are the same in kind. And this equality with the sage is on the basis of a shared innate goodness. It implies that each person can use his own intuitions to claim for himself knowledge of the good, and on that basis criticize reigning authority, potentially even the authority of the ancient sage kings and other exemplars of moral cultivation. So these implications are picked up in later forms of Confucianism, Neo-Confucianism, most famously that associated with Wang Yang, that emphasize direct, intuitive engagement with classical texts and mediated by commentarial or other authorities as a way for individual readers to absorb the values that they propagated. This is what Yang Ming called the inherent benevolent knowing within every person, which would ensure her intuitive grasp of a single moral order found both within herself as well as within the patterns of the greater cosmos. We touched a bit on this dilemma, I think, in a seminar when we were talking, Ariel raised the point about the connection between interpersonal and social or cosmological order. And some of this gets picked up with Wang Yang, we'll see that in a bit. But this doesn't always, so this is sort of the Mencian view, but this view about cultural difference in which people sort of participate in a singular moral order, right? Like something by looking within themselves, they would find something that is the same for everyone. It resonates a bit with someone like Immanuel Kant in European political philosophy, or European philosophy. So we have this way of thinking, but as we know, as we discussed in the last lecture, I mentioned very briefly that this approach to cultural difference did not entirely originate with Mencius, but it turns upon earlier and quite pervasive claims in pre-Qing literature that conceptualize human virtue as a unified set of values whose cultivation is served exclusively by certain forms of civilization. And this is a Zhou bell. It's actually it's a bell, a bronze bell from the Zhou Dynasty, and it's in the collection of the British Library, or the British Museum, sorry, which is the only reason I chose this, because it's in a museum where I live. But about a century prior to Mencius, Confucius had already briefly raised the issue of human nature in a way that reveals the stakes of such a premise. He says human natures are similar, practices are far apart. That's the Analect 17th. Although brief this passage is revealing, it is perhaps no coincidence that here Confucius mentions practice as the determining feature of human difference. So he doesn't find difference in shape, he finds it on the level of difference. For Confucius, practices, specifically those associated with Leigh, literally ritual and etiquette, but more accurately, what we might say the forms appropriate to social actions, like ritual, play a key role in enabling both individual moral self-realization and social harmony. So just as importantly, they are also central to perpetuating a specific cultural formation. And for Confucius, that was embodied in the Eastern Zhou Dynasty, the same civilization who produced this bell, seen as constituting a universally applicable model for civilizations. Much of Confucius' teaching in the Analects, in fact, could be read as explaining how this model of civilization, of Zhou's, specifically Zhou's civilization, is brought into being by the everyday rehearsal of its practices, ritual, music, and etiquette, which have the potential to enact a deeply transformative change in both the identity and character of an individual as well as a society. An individual properly versed in these practices through a lifetime of study becomes gentleman. A society properly versed in these practices becomes civilized. So this is the idea of Confucius, right? He doesn't talk as much about human nature as Mencius does, but he talks a lot about ritual and about the kinds of everyday practices and forms of etiquette that constitute civilization per se. And in lecture 1, we saw a similar approach to Jenco in his travels to Taiwan. Because here, the premise of a shared human nature, which he's getting from Mencius, supports the displacement of culturally dissimilar ways of life by the norms of a unified Chinese civilization. And this would be a theory that is supported in part by the Confucian idea that ritual is a socially and cosmologically ordering kind of human institution or a human practice. One of the most dramatic and definitive pronouncements of such a possibility, that is, the idea that humanity could be saved only by a retrenchment of civilization anchored in the authority of the true sages, or the Zhou dynasty, is Han Yu's 8th century essay on the origins of the Way, called the Yuan Da, which had tremendous influence on the way later thinkers, particularly the Song and Ming, would link the development of moral capacity to participation in civilization, or what they call culture wood. They tied that civilization to a very specific set of commitments that identified Confucian conceptions of humaneness and rightness as the common, he says, literally the common interpretation of the world. So in the textbook Sources of Chinese Tradition, I don't know if anybody still uses that, Ted DeBerry's big anthology of translated Chinese source material. In this textbook, William DeBerry identifies this essay, this Yuan Da essay, whose title he revealingly somewhat inaccurately translates as, quote, Essentials of the Moral Way, unquote. He calls this one of the most important texts in the history of Chinese political thought. It presents, DeBerry argues, nothing less than an attempt to define the distinguishing characteristics of Chinese civilization versus countercultural conceptions of the way. So in other words, we have here this 8th century statement from Han Yu. We have a very clear conceptualization of how Chinese civilization per se can refute. DeBerry calls them countercultural conceptions of the way. He's talking about non-Chinese civilization of cultures. So it's retrenchment of a certain interpretation of Chinese Confucian values amid what we might recognize as an intensifying influence of Islam, Manichaeanism, and Nestorianism on Han Yu's Tang Dynasty frontiers. Also reviewed the broad eclecticism of political and religious thought, particularly the synthesis of Buddhism with Taoism and Confucian values that had marked elite thinking in the Chinese metropole since the Han Dynasty. In Han Yu's view, those who practice foreign teachings or their indigenous appropriations, quote, abrogated the principles of human relations. Although they are sons, they do not regard their fathers as fathers. Although ministers, they do not regard their ruler as ruler, unquote. Han Yu saw that only remedies this barbarization of civilization or culture as a return to a specific set of Confucian texts, practices, and social relationships that he associates with the ancient sage kings. He says, quote, what is the teaching of the former kings? To love largely is called a sense of humaneness. To act according to what should be done is called rightness. To proceed from these principles is called the moral way. To be sufficient unto oneself without relying on externals is called inner power. Its texts are the odes, documents, the changes, and the spring and autumn annals. Have you heard of these texts? Heard of some of the changes you've probably heard of these, right? The odes. These are all canonical classical Chinese texts, right? Of various historical periods. Its methods are the rites, music, chastisement, and government. Its classes of people are scholars, peasants, craftsmen, and merchants. Its social relationships are ruler and minister, father and son, teacher and pupil, guest and host, older and younger brother, husband and wife. Its dress is hemp and silk, its dwellings are houses, its foods are rice and grains, fruits and vegetables, fish and meat. Its ways are easy to explain, its teachings are easy to execute. As these comments indicate, Han Yu, and indeed many future colonial administrators seeking to transform frontier peoples on the basis of Confucian principles, understood civilization to include not only a set of values such as humaneness or rightness, as defined by something like Mencius, right? But also a set of hierarchical social relationships modeled on the father-son relationship. It extended also to include how and what kinds of structures one lived, what kinds of foods one ate, and how one dressed. To Han Yu, only through such extreme transformations in their practices could those following foreign or sullied doctrines be made human, literally made human, and the disadvantage of the realm be properly cared for. These arguments explain why typical justifications for Chinese civilizing projects are not rooted in a doctrine of racial superiority or even out of a desire to exploit the economic resources of other states. And here we're recalling some of the post-colonial scholarship, more contemporary post-colonial scholarship that sees colonialism as defined by these projects. Although Han Yu's essay implies violence towards dissenters, Mencius and his later followers tend to present their arguments for cultural transformation of other societies in terms of a deep ethical and humanitarian commitment to developing human moral capacity, which they claim to be welcomed by the people, if not the ruler of conquered states. In a passage that Miyakawa identifies as central to later justifications of the political and cultural subjugation of indigenous peoples in southern China, Mencius narrates a story from the ancient book of documents to persuade King Shen, ruler of the state of Qi, to continue his campaign to conquer the state of Yan, despite resistance from the rulers of neighboring states. Patrick had asked a question about this morning, about the state of Yan and this campaign to conquer. Actually, in this case, and this is so Mencius is actually quoting the book of documents here, but as advisor to King Shen, Mencius urges him to deepen his military campaign in the state of Yan for humanitarian purposes. That is to carry out humane governance that Mencius defines as securing a livelihood to the people through economic development, or some form of what we would call economic development, and the implementation of clear hierarchical relations between family members. In other words, Mencius here argues that King Shen's annexation of the state of Yan for the purposes of introducing the culture of the Central States is not only justified, but required as a means to rescue the people. He actually uses the word rescue the people of Yan. So here, Mencius is actually urging the extension of, he's encouraging a military campaign for humanitarian purposes. One of the strongest and most politically influential statements of this logic, ironically, was voiced not by a Han Chinese, but a Manchu ruler. The Yongzheng Emperor's 1730 treatise, Dai Jun Wu, which is often translated into English as Great Righteousness Resolving Confusion, which is an awkward title, but that is what the term means, advanced the defense of the Qing dynasty on the grounds that it better served the principles of humane government articulated by Mencius and other sages than had the previous Ming dynasty. So there he is there, the man of the hour. Central to his argument was the equally mentioned claim that a person's place of origin or status as barbarian were irrelevant to a human capacity to be virtuous. Yongzheng is specifically interested in demonstrating how the virtuous capacity of rulers enables them to achieve the blessing of heaven and the spontaneous submission of their subjects. From ancient times, only those with virtue ruled all under heaven, Yongzheng argues. So the key criterion of justified rule was the quality of their virtue, not their place of origin. He says, like what place are these people? That is irrelevant. One important consequence of this argument is that it erases the Chinese barbarian distinction that historically had functioned to discriminate against foreigners inhabiting territories bordering the Chinese state. Yongzheng says, quote, "Once our dynasty submitted to the heavenly mandate and became ruler of both China and outside, minister and people, then how could those who spread peace and love, see Chinese and barbarian as ever more different? And once China and outside, minister and people elevated our dynasty as ruler, then those who return to loyalty, that means basically those who surrender trust, or return to loyalty and submit, fulfilling the way of the people and minister, are even less able to take Chinese and barbarian as having separate parts." Yongzheng's defense of Qing legitimacy turns on mention and broader Neo-Confucian beliefs in the fundamental malleability of human beings when confronted with forms of self-evidently superior virtue. Insofar as Chinese culture and virtues could transform barbarians, Yongzheng could claim his own dynasty as so suitably transformed that its very administration secures long-standing Chinese values associated with ancient sages, such as caring for the masses, ensuring the practice of proper familial and political hierarchies, and most importantly, unifying all under heaven in a singular reign of virtue. In pacifying territories and peoples in revolt, Yongzheng argues, the Qing has rescued the people of the central lands, this would be the self-identified Chinese, from the violence and instability that plagued the former Chinese-dominated Ming dynasty. In doing so, the Qing, despite its origins in northern Manchuria, outside of what critics would take to be China proper, establishes a meaningful connection to the teaching of the ancient sages, and thereby legitimates its rule in the sovereign succession of Chinese dynasties. So Yongzheng's argument, voiced as it is by a putative outsider to the Chinese cultural tradition, takes Confucian arguments about the transformation of foreigners to their extreme but logical conclusion. If foreign others can become Chinese through embodiment of virtues identified with the practices and teachings of Chinese civilization, then so too can they rule Chinese territory with a legitimate mandate. Yongzheng extended this mandate to include not only Qing rule of Han Chinese, but also the deliberate acculturation of minority populations on the southern and northern borders of the Qing state. In a decree dating to about 1730, for example, Yongzheng responded to violence ascribed by official sources to Miao bandits in Yunnan province. Although he advised harsh punishments against the Miao, whom he associates with villainous and murderous criminals, he argues that his policies always take, quote, civilization and amnesty as the root, unquote. He cannot bear, as he claims, to see the Miao barbarians as alone outside the pale of civilization. Much like Mencius's interpretation of violence in the State of Yen, here too, Yang Zheng argues that measures of cultural transformation are both morally necessary and practically beneficial to those upon whom they are visited. Right, so here again we have an actual specific historical argument for the extension of humane governments into the Yunnan. So the assimilationist premise is encouraged by the mentioned philosophical anthropology of Qing. So here we would be talking about, let me see if that point, oh, that pointer does work, you can see it, right? Yeah. So we were really talking about this line here. Right now we're going to think a bit about this line, especially Wang Zhi. Right, so we're going to be talking about, I call it separatism or indifference. It's also a materialist viewpoint. It's based on material and historical differences, right? We're going to be talking more about this third line down. All right. So, such assimilationist premises, encouraged by the mentioned philosophical claim of shame, as evidence in people like Yang Zheng, were countered by claims that civilized persons, usually construed as Chinese, I haven't talked much about the terminology for Chinese and barbarian, usually they're talking about Hua and Ming, as we picked up earlier, but usually construed as Chinese, possessed materially dissimilar nations to barbarians. Yang Zheng responds directly, in fact, to an undercurrent of contemporary literati opinion that rejected Qing rule on the basis of its rulers' different ethnicity and places of origin. In their extreme form, voiced most vociferously by literati who personally witnessed her transition from the end of the Ming Dynasty to the establishment of the Qing. Such arguments held that the barbarian Chinese distinction was of greater importance for the ancient sages than even was their teaching of ethical relationships. So this refuted orthodox views about the nature of Confucianism prominent since the Song Dynasty. So this is a fairly radical and actually quite subterranean claim. It was never really a mainstream view. But many of these intellectuals, including the tongue-twisting name Liu Liang. Try saying that 5 times you can. I rehearsed that for this talk to make sure I didn't say Liu Liang, whose ideas were revived by this guy Zhang Jing in the Qing Dynasty. And it was this guy Zhang Jing was sort of a zealot who tried to revive the Ming Dynasty on the basis of St. Christ Liu Liang's ideas. And it was Liu Liang's ideas that constitute the main target of Yang Zheng's attack. Right? I'm going to try to avoid saying it anyway. Advised Han Chinese against starting the Qing regime. So one of the most radical though of these literati critics was Wang Fushi, who advocated violent restoration of Ming rule and the forceful expulsion of the Manchus back to their northern homelands. According to Wang, as barbarians, the Manchus were not even quite human. He says, quote, as for barbarians, destroying them implies no lack of benevolence, attacking them implies no lack of righteousness, and tricking them implies no lack of good faith, unquote. Why so? Because to him, good faith and righteousness are principles to be practiced between one man and another, but they are not to be extended to an alien species. Now, I have to find, so this quote that I just read here, it was cited in an English language scholarly article about the Ming Qing transition intellectuals, and that was citing Derek Botta's early work on harmony in Chinese philosophy. And Derek Botta was citing Feng Youlan's History of Chinese Philosophy in English translation. So I have yet to, so this is a four-way, like this has come through four layers of citation. I have yet to find this specific quote. I mean, I think it generally embodies what Wang Fushi is saying, but the reason I'm highlighting the fact that I've yet to find it, this translation of something as alien species, I'm not sure, that's what really bugs me, is what is he calling a species? He's probably talking about Leigh, types. He's talking about human kinds or human types, not necessarily about different species. So keep this in mind, keep this kind of ambiguity in mind. What is it exactly that does it make sense to talk about these kinds of differences for Wang Fushi in terms of species? Or should we just say something less loaded, maybe speak of them in terms of kinds, or just types or differences? In ascribing to Manchu rulers a fundamentally different nature to Han Chinese, these arguments appear analogous to the racial discourse that would animate European colonialism several centuries later. As Wang's statement shows, it certainly acts to justify certain forms of violence that one group perceived as other. So he did actually advocate a violent. I mean, he himself was a literati, and he did organize some military resistance to Ming rule. He had tried to establish it in southern. He tried to assert I don't know. There's a name for this, like when a court goes into exile. So in southern China, he tried to serve that court. He tried to provide the Ming Dynasty for the organization of military groups and paramilitary groups. Although he himself wasn't much of a fighter, but he's a literati. But in drawing on a range of different sources, including the Book of Changes, which was a cosmological speculation since, well, the Song Dynasty, but I mean the book itself is ancient. These accounts, like Wang's, produce a materialist, I'd argue, rather than biological or proto-biological account of human nature and this identity. So for Wang, differences in human types, which he pretty consistently refers to as Leigh, were a consequence of their agglomeration or dispersal of Qi, a vital force whose movements in his view constituted an unstoppable and unceasing natural effect of principles and conditions. Do you know what Qi I'm talking about? Like Qi, Feng Qi, or Qi Feng, sorry. To Wang, it would be a category mistake to refer to natural forms in terms of production and extinction. Shangmiya, or there's a Buddhist term, Pananirada, is that right? I don't know. He was talking, he explicitly addressed his work to contemporary Buddhist metaphysics, and he says there is no such thing as extinction, like the Buddhists would have it. Rather, what we have is just Qi constantly here, like a material force floating around, agglomerating, dispersing, concatenating, and cycling over again, right? In ceaseless movements, it produces and structures both natural phenomena and human values, according to the laws and principles of the cosmos. Those of you interested in Republican Chinese political thought, these ideas come up again in the work of a fellow Hunanese, this guy Tan Sitong, if you've ever heard of Tan Sitong. That's actually how I ended up learning a bit about Wang Fuji, because I was interested in Tan Sitong, who uses these ideas again to talk about how Chinese can learn from barbarian Westerners. But this kind of materialist doctrine became very prevalent in the late Republican period, in the late Qing and early Republican period, because of a number of Hunanese intellectuals who were interested in Wang Fuji's work as a fellow Hunanese, oddly enough. Anyway, this particular agglomeration of Qi determines the order and principles which structure categories or types of natural and human order. He says, so Wang Fuji says, when the Qi agglomerates, its existence is visible. But when it is dispersed, one may suspect that it is non-existent. Once it is agglomerated and assumed forms and images, then as regards talents, Cai, matter like Zhi, nature, Xing, and passions, Qing, all accord with their own categories, right? They accept what is similar and impose what is different, and thus all things flourish in profusion and form their various categories. The formation of each of these categories has its own organization. So it is that dew, thunder, frost, and snow all occur at their proper times, and animals, plants, birds, and fish all keep to their own species. There can be no frost or snow during the long summer evenings in Heidelberg. I feel very, very far from frost or snow. Nor can there be dew or thunder in the depths of winter. Nor can there be between man and beast, plant and tree any indiscriminate confusion of their respective principles. So you can see, he's going from a materialist understanding of how Qi sort of circulates in the world to an explanation of different types or categories of things, objects, and people. And from there, talking about the values that are appropriate to each of them. So Wang Fuji, this is all the work of Qi. We saw a bit of this in lecture 1 when we talked about the Taiwanese in the Gazetteers. You remember there was a very kind of imprecise discussion about where human difference comes from. They say it comes from the circulation of Qi and the different kinds of climate. I see that as very much influenced by what Wang Fuji is saying here. I don't have evidence of a direct textual link, but it certainly seems to be at least drawing from the same source, the same kinds of philosophy of difference. So the working of such materialist forces is often articulated by Wang and his fellow thinkers, including Hu Yangwu, as a form of geographical determinism that link the environment to particular forms of civilization or barbarism. Wang Fuji explains that the material natures of foreign others, based on their particular agglomerations of Qi, must match their living environments. So one consequence of this reasoning was that different kinds of peoples should be separated physically and geographically, so as not to contaminate each other. Wu Yanwu formulated this as barbarian and Chinese should not mix. Rong, Huang, Huza. Actually, there shouldn't be any kind of. I have yet to determine. I mean, they were speaking at a very basic level. They just didn't want the Manchus inside China proper. But I'm wondering if there was also a gender dynamic to this, where they were talking about intermarriage or forms of, literally forms of interbreeding or something like that. I'm not sure about that. I know that just for a fact they're talking mainly about geography. Wang explains that although barbarians share a physical appearance with Chinese, they are nevertheless different from them in the same way that humans are different from other creatures. Therefore, he says, if humans are not able to self-demarcate in order to delineate their own groups, human order collapses. So the word Wang is using to mean demarcate is zhen, this zhen, which means literally to raise paths between agricultural fields. It was used by Zhuangzi in his well-known essay, Discourse on Unequal Things, the Qing of Zhuangzi, to describe arbitrary distinctions that complicate rather than fix their identity. So for Zhuangzi, this word was an incredibly bad word. It was all about what you don't want to do, because when you try to fix identities, you try to draw borders around things, you end up confusing. You end up becoming farther away from the way than closer to it. But Wang Fuzhi is the opposite. He says exactly the opposite. He departs from this conventional, sort of more Taoist usage to endorse boundaries as constitutive of a properly functioning human, territorial, and cosmic order. He calls Ren Wei, Yi Wei, and Tian Wei. The Manchu presence in China was thus a violation of terrestrial order, because one group had passed into the border territory of another. He argues that if the boundaries between natural and human kinds, both between humans and other creatures, as well as between barbarian and Chinese, and here he's using D, like Rome D as barbarian, were not properly policed, these boundaries weren't policed, the active maintenance required to sustain Chinese civilization might slacken, and its people might fall into barbarism. Such anxieties about the potential barbarization of Chinese people shows that such arguments are not necessarily premised on the denial of the human capacity for cultural transformation. Rather, the differences between these materialist arguments and more culturalist Mencian accounts lies more in the mechanism and speed of transformation than they do in the denial that such transformation is possible. In fact, like Mencius and his Neo-Confucian interpreters, Wang Fuzhi and Wu Yanwu also anchored their discussion of this possibility in the nature of Qing. For Wang Fuzhi, interacting with Qi and the natural environment, it constituted, helped to perfect and complete the natural qualities found in our Qing. Qing is something, he says, that is, quote, daily generated and daily completed, unquote, by way of the repeated and habitual practices that help shape our, what he called his a posteriori nature, or hou tian zhi xi. So he thought we had a sort of an inward nature and then a posteriori nature. And he was really only interested in that, like our Qing after, not really in that pre-reflective nature of born with, but rather what we do with it after we're born, like the kind of practices and moral cultivation that we engage in after we're born. Unlike earlier Neo-Confucians such as Juxi, for example, or even people like Mencius, Wang here denies that there exists an a priori good nature. Rather, Qing is malleable to human intervention on a daily basis. I suppose this makes him really maybe some more even legalist thinkers. There is not, as Juxi posited, any duality between principle and Qi. Rather, to Wang, they are two aspects of the same thing that are developed in close relation to one's worldly interactions. If one interacts with the wrong kinds of things unsuited to one's nature, then one becomes subject to their encroachments and can develop practices that are unsuited to the nature endowed by habit. So we have a similar argument as Mencius here, where Wang is worried about people going into different kinds of environments. So, for example, I've been living in Britain now for 7 years, and like many British people, I've become afraid of the sun because it's rainy there. I'm serious. I never thought this would happen to me, because it's very, very damp and cold and rainy there. And so I kind of get used to that cloudy weather, and I kind of like it. It's a little bit cooler. It doesn't usually get hot. It hasn't, well, except for global warming, it doesn't get hot and bright like this. When I come into an environment like this, I feel like it's not suited to my nature. So what Wang Fuzhi would say, if a British person came, to Italy especially, right, that's really sunny and hot, that it would lead to some kind of moral consequence, where the British person would then suddenly become unable to cope and adapt, and their morality might become corrupted because they're in the wrong place. So the obvious solution would be to just put the British person back in Britain in the nice cloudy weather in that climate that suited his or her, his natural, heaven-mandated kind of nature. And if we cultivate that nature that is proper to us in our proper environment, then that is what will lead to happiness or fulfillment, cultivation of our state. So, these metaphysical arguments provide an obvious and important basis for Wang's separatist environmental theory. If it is practices which restore, complete, and maintain the original nature of the Qing in its relationship with things and the production of qi, then foreign or barbarian practices may be seen as particularly harmful, not despite but precisely because they are adapted, as one might note, in response to a particular time and place. All right? So practices evolve in a very specific context-dependent way, and if we try to mess around with them, everything's going to fall into confusion. The human order will collapse. So although in its extreme form expressed only by Wang and Liang Wu and a few other Ming loyalists attempting to discredit the legitimacy of the Qing regime, versions of this argument, grounded in human differences in geographical or material forces, ramified more widely throughout Chinese discussions of the Sino-centric world order. We saw some of them already in Lecture 1 with the Taiwanese, the gazetteers of Taiwan. But as James Millward, for example, has shown, even as late as the late 19th century, certain territorial markers such as the Jiayu Pass, situated near the end of the Great Wall in central Gansu, continued to delineate the boundary of civilization from wilderness for many Han Chinese literati. So he collects a few sort of reflections by Han literati going to the Jiayu Plan and sort of saying, this is the end of civilization. I feel like I'm on the border of barbarity, and there's just the terrifying wilderness that goes beyond the Great Wall. Despite the fact that by that point it was well within Qing jurisdiction, so it was already incorporated from the Qing. It wasn't actually the wilderness, but there was this felt sense of a geographic separatism. Now, Frank Decoder, I don't know, am I saying it's a German decoder? Is that how you say? Do you know Frank Decoder? Decoder. Oh, I was saying it wrong. I'm out of my element. Did you see what happens when I'm removed from the geographic place in which I'm supposed to be? Frank Decoder. Okay. So he has this famous examination of race in China, in modern China. He's explicitly identified these ideas in Wang Fuzhi as Lebensraum. Am I saying that word right? Lebensraum? It's a nonsense term, sorry. Lebensraum, or living space, was a doctrine elaborated by the German geographer Friedrich Ratzel in 1901 to explain human existence as a struggle for racial domination. So Ratzel, another German race theorist like Adolf Hitler, you've heard of him, explicitly invoked the doctrine to justify settler colonialism, state expansion, and the extermination of less civilized peoples. That's what Lebensraum is about. Now, it's an interesting association that Frank Decoder makes these with Wang Fuzhi. Because despite these assertions, the similarity shared by these doctrines, these Lebensraum doctrines, the Chinese arguments for geographical determination is, I think, quite superficial. Is Patrick here? He isn't. No, he isn't. He raised because he was talking about this book in the first lecture. So, because arguments such as those of Wang Fuzhi this is my argument anyway, are rooted in a cosmology of change rather than one of biological fixity or quantifiability, they entail different consequences to Lebensraum. Most prominently, rather than promoting territorial expansion or the conquest of foreign peoples, Chinese materialist arguments almost always condone Chinese separation from, rather than annexation or integration of foreign peoples. Do you know what this is? Anyone? It's a beautiful, actually, it's a beautiful image, but it actually does something for my argument. It's actually a map of Taiwan. I am going to talk about Taiwan in this lecture, I promise. This is the Han original boundary, one of them. So the boundary itself tended to move eastward over time. This is the red boundary. And above, I think that's the purple boundary. This one is purple. So this is a Qianlong era map that's trying to show where the Chinese households, the Han settler households are, and then in the north of it, where the indigenous peoples, the villages of the indigenous peoples were. The problem is that the map, the line kept moving eastward and northward, shoving out, so making more and more space for Han settlers and less space for the indigenous peoples. I'm going to talk about it right now. So when elaborated as part of the arguments for Chinese colonial presence on Taiwan, returning to Taiwan, such premises of geographical determinism supported policies that in some ways protected indigenous peoples from Han incursion. So as we saw earlier with Bin Chen Wang, one of the first Qing appointed colonial administrators in Taiwan, they claimed a different and fundamentally savage nature for the raw Aborigines, especially for the raw ones, the indigenous peoples. But it was precisely because of that difference that they promoted separation rather than integration of Aboriginal with Han communities. Right? So they said that the indigenous peoples, they're bloodthirsty, they're just different. So rather than say, let's wipe them out, they said, just live separately. Those administrators and policymakers who insisted on seeing indigenous peoples as possessing a human Qing tended to promote colonization, which effectively amounted to ever deeper Han incursion into indigenous territory and the gradual conversion of the island into a Qing administrative province. So here we have something, I think, opposite of what we might expect in a lot of European colonial discourse, where the more like us the other was seen as, the more likely Chinese administrators were to advocate colonization and assimilation. The more different they were seen to be, the more likely Chinese administrators were to urge separation. Hence the boundary. Right? So one prominent example, John Shepard, in his pioneering work on statecraft in Imperial Taiwan and Qing Taiwan, has shown that throughout the Yongjang era, which is 1723 to 1735, the existing quarantine policies that were currently in place for the island were abandoned one by one for pro-colonization policies after there was an anti-Qing rebellion called the Juigui Rebellion in 1721. After that rebellion, a lot of the Qing was very worried about, okay, now we really have to figure out what to do with Taiwan, because the quarantine that we have set up, where we say nobody can go to the island, A, isn't working anyway because people are going, and B, it's still not reducing the violence because we still have these major uprisings that were often led by a combination of Han settlers and indigenous people against the Qing. And the Qing had a lot of trouble suppressing them, actually. It sometimes was going on for months before they could really get everything in order. So one of his policies included the expansion of Qing administrative units through the subdivision of Zhuguo County and the creation of Jianghua County and Danshui Prefecture in 1723. So what he decided to do was deepen colonization of Taiwan, particularly by installing a civil government, deepening and expanding the civil government that was already there. So we might understand these moves as being legitimated and understood partially through reference to the ideas of Yongjang himself and his administrators, including somebody like Lan Dingyuan. I don't talk much about him. And also the acting Taiwanese prefect, Shen Qiyuan at the time, who seems to share his views about the capacity of these indigenous peoples to become more culturally Chinese through exposure to Chinese modes of governance and rituals. So they bought into this mentioned story that the indigenous could be transformed, and therefore they advocated greater colonization of the island. Administrative expansion on the island, undertaken as part of the larger process of what Shepard explicitly calls colonization, was intended to transform Han immigrants into law-abiding, family-focused, virtuous residents, mainly by allowing women to travel to the island. Right? This might have been part of the problem. You let a bunch of men alone on their own without any women. The level of civilization tends to plummet. This is a sociological fact. I'm just observing this. There was actually experiments done in Antarctic research stations when they allowed more women. Suddenly, the research stations are cleaner and people are living more like humane, civilized persons. But if it's just men, like on their own, all they do apparently is like drink and bowl, and they do their scientific research on the side, and nothing is clean. But apparently, this is seriously what happens. Right? Anyway, the point is that one of the debates they had in the Qing was, should we let women go to the island, which means that men could marry women and then they could settle down and have families, right? They don't have to live like pirates, like single men on their own, running around doing piratical things. As men tend to do, right? So we could deepen that, and then to take also, more importantly, the raw and cooked Aborigines further along their own path towards civilization. So everybody ended up basically reproducing the social, gender, sexual, economic, political, ritual, burial organizations of Chinese civilization. Everybody becomes better people this way. That was the idea. In contrast, policies of separation or quarantine were more prominent features of Taiwan policy under the succeeding Qianlong emperor, whose consolidation of the Qing state went hand in hand with an imperial cosmology that hardened boundaries between cultural identities. Those of you familiar with Pamela Crossley's Shenzu's Mirror, she talks at length about Qianlong's identity politics. One manifestation of Qianlong's cosmology was the delineation of a Han Aboriginal boundary across northern Taiwan. In a series of 4 cadastral surveys beginning in 1750, the court, under Qianlong, delineated a line intended to separate living areas of Han from raw indigenous groups, and in this way to prevent unrest. So they were informed by a philosophy of separatism. And then also a philosophy in which you have clear bounded identities, like that that's actually possible, that you can have an identity as an indigenous person and as a Han. But in fact, we know that there was a lot of intermarriage between Han and particularly indigenous women on the island, because for a long time, Han women were allowed to go to Taiwan. So for such views, and certainly in the case of Taiwan, a perceived difference between peoples led to indifference, or at least a forced separation in this case, toward non-Chinese populations, rather than a transformation through colonial intervention. In practice, under Qianlong, the Han Aboriginal boundary moved continually eastward as Han settlers increasingly claimed outer Aboriginal territory to satisfy demand from Fujian for rice. So this would be like one example. Can you see the It's nothing. There it is. Okay, so in this area here, this is the boundary. Over about 10 or 12 years, if you take another cadastral survey, you can see it's moving northern and eastward. So there's more and more Han in this part of the island. Oops. Didn't mean to do that. In any case, so in practice it didn't work that well, but the theory behind it is what I'm interested in. The theory behind the boundary, the idea that separation would solve problems of conflict by enabling both groups to live in a space suited to their needs and lifestyles, echoes the materialist principles of Wong's the truth again. So to test this hypothesis, I thus wager the following. This is the least developed part. Just warning you. It's a wager. I think it's correct, but it's just still a wager at this point. I don't have proof. I thus wager the following. The greater the difference claimed to exist between Chinese and non-Chinese, the greater the indifference, and vice versa. We might test this observation by examining the policy suggestions of a well-known frontier general, who also happened to become one of the most influential philosophers of all time. I say of all time. People would say most influential Chinese philosopher, but he influenced a huge number of people. I think he deserves a little credit, doesn't he? And a really interesting guy, as it happens. I've been reading a lot about him. He does things that a lot of us don't do. I mean, he was actually a very successful frontier general, who was also a very, very successful philosopher at the same time. Wong's idea is of particular interest here because he offers a sophisticated defense of a shared universal human nature. He calls it shame. I mean, so this is a time in the Ming when there's a lot of discussion about not just human nature, but also what clouds it, what makes it not, what makes those sprouts that Mensch has identified not develop into fully fledged moral human beings. And his response was that we all have this original nature. But it's sometimes in tension with our actions and explanations. So Wong's own theory, his philosophy, many people have seen it as consistently carried throughout his life. But as it turns out, that's not always the case. So at times, the Neo-Confucian strand of philosophy, for which he became so well known, was beautifully elaborated in his memorials in defense of humane treatment for rebellious self-governing provinces, or self-governing villages in southwest China. So he actually, so I've been reading a lot of his memorials, which in the past I'd only ever known Wang for his philosophy, for his Neo-Confucian philosophy, but I've been reading a lot of his memorials where he'll sort of explain his strategic reasons for doing one thing or another, particularly on the southern frontier, so he's sent there twice. And some of these memorials give you a beautiful elaboration of Neo-Confucian principles and practice. He sort of says, okay, these people are basically good. What we need to then do is figure out a way so that their good human nature can be developed, right? It's classic Mencius in a way, and he thinks through about, okay, what is causing them, what are the things in their environment that are causing them to act that way? Well, it could be that they're starving. It could be that they have these long-standing grievances against other clans. It could be that that they are running out, that they're having conflicts with these corrupt Chinese officials. That was another thing that made him very unpopular, actually. Sort of identified the fact that the Ming administration in the southern provinces was not always virtuous. And then he would set out to try to do something about it. So he set about trying to administratively organize the place. But then at other times, he makes comments about the animal natures of these peoples, these same peoples in southwest China. And he subjects them to brutal pacification campaigns, one of which led to the decapitation of 3,000 bandits and the destruction of countless lives in villages in central Guangxi. I mean, so kind of extreme, right? I mean, that to me is really interesting in itself. So some observers of Wang's divided position deny that it exists. Some people just flat out deny it he's ever really said anything bad about barbarian empires. Or they see it as an example of Wang's flexibility and pragmatism in dealing with difficult real-world problems. This is the typical philosopher's approach, right? Like, there's philosophy and then there's real life. Others attribute it to a simple contradiction between what Wang argued and what he actually did. I want to argue here, however, that maybe these kinds of contradictory comments reveal the tensions of the two positions I was talking about in this lecture. Wang is poised between a commitment to a universal human nature, which implies a deeply interventionist civilizing project on the one hand, and a belief that the non-Han indigenous peoples of the Southwest are somehow not quite human, and therefore incapable of inclusion into Chinese civilization on the other. I see him as just sort of conflicted about this. He's sort of confronted with an empirical reality he doesn't know how to measure. As a result, Wang's pacification campaigns did not come down on one side or the other clearly. Rather, they ultimately strengthened what was in effect a hybrid form of colonial governance shared between indigenous military leaders, Tusi, you may have heard of these. They had inherited titles to leadership, and they often governed in tandem with a Chinese bureaucrat from the center, from the imperial center. And so this sort of Tusi system was prevalent throughout southwest China and other parts of China, but it led to the development of these large militarized clans who would then often fight with each other, and then occasionally the imperial center would intervene to kind of keep the peace. But it was decided at some point that strategically it wouldn't make sense for the Ming state to penetrate any further into the southwest frontier because they didn't have the capacity to maintain peace all the time. They're basically co-opting local peace, which the United States still does all the time. So Wang's, if you need a contemporary example, I think Saddam Hussein would have been one such person, and I think we were also arming Osama bin Laden. So this is a kind of the same thing. It's like this. It's not full colonization, but it's also not total separation. It's this kind of neither fish nor fowl halfway point. And my wager is that it's explained, that his support for the system is explained in some degree by his own ambivalence about the nature of these peoples. So Wang's own Confucian school of Xinxue, which is often translated into English as learning of the mind and heart, or sometimes it's conflated with other forms of Neo-Confucianism, stands as one of the most influential elaborations of the mentioned province of shared human nature. According to Wang Yongming, when this nature was given proper expression in each individual, it enabled a spontaneous grasp of moral knowledge that did not require prior or further shaping from teachers, texts, or established institutions. He had this famous line, "I don't annotate the classics annotate me." Do you know what that means? He doesn't. So historically, everybody would say, it's sort of like if you were to say, like, the equivalent of the Bible doesn't teach me moral. Doesn't teach my moral code. I teach my moral code to the Bible. It's like that kind of radical statement about the fact that the classics are there to kind of just lead me in my own internal self-understanding, rather than have my internal self-understanding shaped by the classics. So according to Wang, when this nature was given proper expression, it enabled the spontaneous grasp of moral knowledge, of Liangzhi, and we can throw our teachers, our texts, everything else away. He expressed such beliefs when, in a request for further troop deployments in the left river region of Guangxi, so here we are getting into the strategy of it, he urged a strategy for barbarians that he called targeted the heart mind. Gongxi, like gong is in the gongji, like attack, xin is in the xin, like targeted the heart mind. A psychological approach that sought to win over the barbarians in the long term, rather than trying to crush them with violence. Okay, this all sounds fine to you. But like other mentioned arguments, including that of Han Yu, Wang's too stumble when confronting borderline cases in which their subjects display a bewildering array of both human and animal characteristics, or at least do not demonstrate enough of their humanity to determine whether or not they possess the capacity to be truly moral. So here I'm trying to explain, I guess getting back to this question this morning, was Mencius a colonial thinker? Was it, what we're actually looking at here. Barbara liked that question, but she didn't help contribute in any way to the elaboration of it. You should have jumped into the discussion earlier today.
I did.
It would have helped me out. Yeah, you did. That's true.
But I don't think you would.
Yeah, but in a way, we weren't talking about that question, right? We were talking about how Mencius, like the kinds of dilemmas that a Mencian philosophical anthropology produces. Mm-hmm. So one example of this bewilderment, or these dilemmas, can be found in Wang Yangming's description of the non-Chinese native chieftains of Guangxi. So he's trying to hear about the Chusi of Guangxi. He says, quote, "The proper way to treat the Chusi is to adapt one's policy to fit their character. Divide their leadership in order to split up their unity. Establish civil service aides to supervise and control their power. These barbarians are like the wild deer. To institute direct civil administration by Han Chinese magistrates would be like herding deer into the hall of a house and trying to tame them. In the end, they merely butt over your sacrificial altars. I hate when they do that. Kick over your tables and dash about in frantic fright. In the wilderness districts, therefore, one should adapt one's methods to the character of the wilderness. On the other hand, to leave these Chusi to themselves, to conduct their own alliances or split up domains, is like releasing deer into the wilderness without enclosing fences. However, to fragment these domains under separate chieftains or separate Chusi is to follow the policy of erecting restraining fences and is constant with the policy of gelding the stallion and castrating the boar." Very colorful language. But all animal-based, right? It's very animal-based language. Unquote. So here, Wang effectively claims that Chusi, these native chieftains, have their distinct animalistic natures and thus non-human character, akin to wild beer, stallions, or boars, that makes them incapable of integration into the Chinese polity or full self-governance. At the same time, he acknowledges that these indigenous leaders nevertheless possess the capacity to mobilize political power in distinctively human ways, and with enough capacity to resist Chinese colonial intervention in the southwestern frontier. Now, my point is not to accuse Wang Yangming of hypocrisy. I don't think that's a very interesting claim, but rather to illustrate the kinds of dilemmas, both institutional, strategic, and philosophical, produced by the reliance on Qing to articulate difference. The problem is precisely that although Qing discourse posits a claim that all humans share, indeed are defined by, a natural tendency to moral behavior, the absence of such moral behavior, or maybe we should say more precisely, the absence of such behavior legible to Han Chinese elites as moral, or at least as informed by moral understanding, creates indeterminacy around who can be considered as human. So there's just a problem. How do we know that we're looking at someone who's human? How do we know we're looking at a someone, and not a something? As a result, it offers little to no guidance about how to treat or even identify what we might call cultural others. That is, humankinds who display behaviors or participate in social orders that diverge from the spectrum of what Han Chinese literati would consider civilized. So taken together with his other philosophical positions, the passage I just read reveals just how jagged is the boundary for Wang Yangming between civilized persons possessing, or at least being capable of accessing, innate moral knowledge on the one hand, and barbarians unable to properly order themselves or their communities on the other. One thing I would like to continue to research is how and why this ambivalence might translate into policies that are accordingly in between. Right? So I've suggested here that this kind of ambivalence in Wang Yangming's work actually translated into a kind of in-between policy. But I don't know that I've shown it with any kind of demonstrable evidence. So, to what extent does this ambivalence tend to recommend pacification or the installation of a native chieftain system, for example, rather than the integration, suppression, or outright extermination of frontier peoples, which would turn on the spontaneous capacity of these peoples to be both like and unlike the Chinese civilized center? So we have here, if you remember let's see here. I don't know if any of you noticed this, but Wang Yangming is actually on this, he's the only person who's on this lovely taxonomy I made twice. He's there, right there, and then he's up here. Because I wasn't sure, this is actually where I got a lot of these, I wasn't sure quite where to put Wang Yangming. Because on the one hand he seems to be enforcing that, on the other one he seems to be enforcing that third line down, right? He's kind of situated in between. I actually think this ambivalence, I find evidence of this ambivalence reflected elsewhere, such as in proclamations made about these same peoples in Guangxi by the Hongwu, who's the founding emperor Ming. Right? He calls these people Manyao, the Manyao barbarians. So he was responding to one of his officials about the use of force to subdue these barbarians on the basis of the fact that culture and virtue would not work on these people. So one of these administrators comes to Hongwu and says, culture and virtue will not work on them because they're endless. And then the emperor responded to the contrary, quote, although the Qing and customs of the Manyao, these are the barbarians, are different from ours, they're hard to cherish life and hate death, and these are in no way not the same. If they are comforted by peace, treated with sincerity, and given explanations within reason, then are there any who will not submit and transform? Are there any who will not transform? At the same time, he goes on to issue a declaration for the use of force. Quote, I only use military force to order all under heaven, and one in the virtue and culture to transform the peoples far away. This is the advancing by ancient sages and kings of virtue and force simultaneously, bringing to submission both far and near. So you have here an explicit declaration that we advance culture and we advance the civilizing influence and force at the same time, and that we bring to submission both far and near. And he claims this is a doctrine of the ancient sages. So here, I mean, there's evidence that this kind of ambivalence is in other texts, and in other contexts. So this is a very brief conclusion, but really more of a conclusion in need of greater elaboration. Now, someone like Pamela Crossley, you may be familiar with, again, in her book Transition Mirror, she talks about at length about Yongzheng and Qianlong, and she contrasts their I guess the philosophies of identity, you can say that. So for Yongzheng, she says civilization is absolute, and it dissolves cultural differences. So Yongzheng sort of says there is a singular universal civilization. Once you have it, you're civilized, and that's it. And that's a very mentioned claim. But for Qianlong, cultural differences are absolute and require clarification. So Qianlong was like obsessed with boundary drawing, trying to figure out genealogies, like lineages for people, kind of like the blood quantum in Native American legal practice. So in North America and the United States, still to this day, in order to determine if somebody is a member of a tribe, they get blood quantum, like how much blood can you actually trace back to this tribe. So that's an idea of culture that is defined by genealogy rather than by, say, a shared set of practices, language, history, etc. And so both of these ways of thinking about identity contrast with that, with the kind of European thinkers analyzed by someone like Sankramutu. And as well as for contemporary doctrines of relativism, which I'm not going into here right now, but it's interesting that I think nowadays we tend to hold culture itself rather than civilization as a space for identity. So it's the culture that is changed for people. And it's this space of identity that is itself malleable, but usually insurmountable. It's a non-negotiable source of value for its bearers, and this is the source of multicultural politics, contemporary multicultural politics. There's this belief that people have their culture and that somehow informs their values and what they do. So we don't see a similar, this is very different from what we're seeing in these texts, right? Culture does a very different thing. Culture is seen as identified with unifying civilization. It's singular, right? And people's identities vary on the basis of their relation to that singular universal culture. So are we humans, are we animals? How do we know if we're looking at a deer kicking over ancestral altars, or if we're actually looking at a human being? I don't know that I have the answer to those questions, but one of the things I wanted to do with this second lecture is to kind of test the typology that I examined at the beginning, that I put at the beginning, and see if, well, first of all, if it works, but also to see what its implications are, how it actually plays out in policy. So I would thank you for listening, and I invite any kind of comments or questions, especially if you can think of other examples. But thank you.
And you're so bringing up basically Yongzheng as a kind of trans-parallel, right? No boundaries.
Oh, you mean Yongzheng? Yeah.
Yongzheng and Qianlong as who's opposite to Wang Fuchi, right?
Yeah.
Is that the parallels you're drawing, right?
Yeah, I suppose. I wouldn't explicitly. Zhuangzi is just hard. He's very slippery, isn't he?
Exactly, but I was thinking, am I a butterfly or is the butterfly I? Is that there the question of am I an animal or I guess an insect? or human being.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're the
oh, it's
what you were
explicit.
saying, the blurring of the boundaries.
Yeah, oh yeah, I didn't think about that.
Just to give you a sort of maybe another analogy, because I thought it's a very interesting interpretation of drums in terms of borders. I never thought of it in terms of borders becoming blurred. But I think that that is sort of the most explicit of this kind of boundaries. Anyway, it didn't fit with your oxen, but that's not important.
Well, Zhuangzi comes up actually in the next lecture with Chen Li, so I'm looking for these alternatives to these ways of thinking about cultural lens. And it turns out Chen Li, this traveler, happened to be interested in Buddhism, or sorry, Taoism. Mm-hmm. And he visited all these Taoist temples, and he and his friend edited a commentary. Like they redacted the Zhuangzi as well as other sort of texts in the tradition. So.
But I mean,
it doesn't disappear; it's there somewhere. Zhuangzi is the.
Well, he's very interesting in terms of the kinds of things that you're saying in terms of the 4 categories.
Yeah.
Because he really doesn't make differences. We would say in terms of class, in terms of race, in terms of all of these things that you have actually been alluding to. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, that to me was a very interesting take, right? To hear not to take Mencius, but to take Zhuangzi.
Yeah.
Now you have had time to think. Yeah, go ahead.
This is going back to the main topics of the Taiwan and the barbarians, the indigenous people of Taiwan and the indigenous peoples of the Chinese mainland borders, frontiers. The question is that there seems to be quite a big difference between the people who are at the frontiers and they were seen as a piece of the practice, people of mainland, and then people of Taiwan who are separated and seen as aliens. And they're
seen as aliens?
Aliens is a strong word, but it's seen as people separated, and this purity that we could see in the Chengdi writings didn't come in the writings that we were reading. For example, Wang Fuzhi.
So you're suggesting that I need to complicate there isn't just a Chinese barbarian binary, but in fact there are lots of different binaries. Is that what you're?
The binary of the Taiwanese is also could be somehow based on the fact that they're geographically distanced and they were not part of the surroundings, in the sense that they also were not included in the understanding of the world that was surrounding us, and therefore maybe this purity that is later described it's something that differentiates them.
So that's interesting because a lot of these debates were all about, like in the Qianlong Yongzheng and prior, after the Qing annexed Taiwan in 1688, was all about is Taiwan part of us or not? And therefore, what do we do even with the Han settlers? Who are they really Chinese? How do we think about them in terms of identity? I guess are they the object to be transformed, or are they one of the transforming objects? That is to say, are they part of the instrument that will transform the indigenous peoples, for example? So the Han settlers themselves were a very ambivalent status. And I think if you were to not just think about them theoretically, but also if you were to look at them in terms of the practice on the island itself, that they were ambivalent in other ways too, because they were intermarrying with indigenous peoples. And then the indigenous peoples, of course, had all kinds of different identities. They had village identities, they had clan identities. There were lots of different ways that social and political life was organized for them. And then Taiwan itself is maybe a third space where all of these things are happening. It's distinct from every other place, right? So this is something I could probably look more at. I wonder, though, how many of these Han elites that they're producing a lot of these texts, how much they actually understood that. I feel like now, we have the benefit of anthropology, and anthropology gives us these tools for looking at difference in a very specific way, or for recognizing identity as all of these multivalent properties. But at the time, you don't get such nuance from most of these Han writers. But that could just mean I'm looking at the wrong texts, right? There might be other texts out there. more. You remember I told you in the first lecture that the manuscripts written by indigenous people, probably Sarayians in the southwest coast of Taiwan, who learned the language of the Dutch. So they would write Sarayian, their native language, using Romanized letters, right? These exist today. So one way of getting at the voice of these indigenous peoples and to sort of see how they thought of themselves would be to look at these manuscripts. Now most of them they're not philosophical treatises. They're land contracts or they're trade bills or something. They're mainly dealing with business or with commerce, but it could be a possibility to think about. Like I'm trying to think now about what kinds of texts I would find to back up this. Just think more deeply about the layers of it.
So just one part of my question also was how their identity was different from the people from mainland itself, the barbarians of mainland, in a sense that they were seen. That we have this later trendy. The sense of the purity of the people who are untouched somehow. In a sense, if those who were the barbarians of the mainland have been in contact with others just because of the fact that they shared land and they have seen the civilization, and Taiwanese indigenous people haven't seen this civilization. Mm-hmm. So how does this also influence their approach?
When you say influence their approach, whose approach do you mean?
The later Qing dynasty, the Qing dynasty.
So I think there is a bit of recognition that the Han people were just not, if they weren't behaving themselves, they just weren't civilized enough and we needed to educate them better. And there was a lot of discussion about like installing schools on the island and where they should be and what kind of population they should serve and should they teach indigenous peoples as well as the Han settlers. Because mainly, a lot of the colonial writers were just mainly concerned about these Han. A lot of them were concerned about the Han settlers, and they said the Han settlers should learn to keep away from the indigenous peoples, and then there won't be trouble. Right? It's the problem is that these settlers keep pushing further and further into indigenous territory, and then they're attacked, and then there's a counterattack, and then there's a big war, basically, that goes on that the Qing can't suppress. So they recognize it, but I would want you to, I think you're asking me, are there analogies or similarities or dissimilarities between these Han settlers on Taiwan and Han settlers elsewhere in the Qing?
Later in that recognition, before that, so in the recognition, if there is a difference, that it was highly pronounced that they are of a different nature, just because they didn't approach the civilization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't. Aside from what I just said, I don't know that there was a distinct discourse, but there could be.
I'm just wondering that just makes sense. Because it also could come to the understanding that the people of mainland had the possibility to somehow see the entire process, whereas those on Taiwan, they were so separated that they never had a chance to encounter it, and therefore came the purity.
I see. So we have some. Okay, I think I'm getting closer. I'm sorry that this thing. I think I'm finally realizing it's finally dawning on me what he's asking. I know that, for example, in like Yunnan, so provinces that were seen as remote, into which Chinese settlers or administrators were sent, were similar to Taiwan in a sense. But the idea was that they would sort of bring with them the civil administration would bring with them the culture of the Central Plains, and that this in itself, with a little bit of institutional maneuvering, would basically do what it needed to do. There wasn't necessarily a sense that it was different, or there was a different kind of problem. It was the problem of quantity, not of quality. Like the problem itself was seen as the same. It was just a bigger problem or a smaller problem, but it's the same problem of bringing these Han settlers into just making them better people. So in this sense, it wasn't talked about in terms of they weren't civilized. It was talked about they were just immoral people because they had bad habits. Like you don't know, says this explicitly. Yeah. Sort of.
Just part. Yeah. Okay. That part. But before, yes.
But before, what was the before?
No, that was just the last part of the question.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. If there's other parts of the question, yeah. Don't hate.
Yes.
Thank you for the fascinating talk. I heard that's something to work with and thinking about these Asian schools difference, which is very much interesting right now. The question is mainly speculative, but just wondered if we could some views on this ambivalence that you mentioned in one future and one have these thought on the difference. Whether we could maybe trace some of that back to earlier Neo-Confucian discourses on Qing, especially this my understanding that Neo-Confucian thought, especially that of Leigh's song, Southern song, and later had nationalistic elements in it.
Oh, okay.
About civilization. But in this case, as actually the Han Chinese being, at least in militaristic terms, on the weaker side. So it would be civilization as a self-strengthening self-conception of being civilized and being superior as a way of strengthening their own views about themselves. Against these
when they were conquered.
Stronger, yeah, exactly. So that I would imagine genealogically these thoughts about human nature, the difference. There were some of these elements. I would assume that there were some of these elements that arose at least during the Song Dynasty and later that were definitely the materials that these later thinkers worked with when they also worked with the same concepts, whereas they were of course using it for the opposite purposes, but that, yeah.
Yes, I see what you mean. So like in the Southern Song, because of the UN threat, right, they formulated this self-perception of themselves as being a civilizational center, even though they weren't militarily very strong.
Yes, and that whether they were not like really building on this conceptual toolkit during that era out of these psychological reasons.
Yeah.
In a way that later thinkers also would have found very important in thinking about difference themselves.
Yes. I have thought about this. I don't know. I mean, I haven't gone back far enough, so I was thinking I'm going to be self-limiting and just talk about the Ming. But I mean, it's hard to do that when every time they talk about the Manchus, they're talking about the Yuan dynasty and like the Mongols and trying to find like they're very self-conscious of their continuity with the Southern Song in this case. And it's interesting too. There's also continuity with what Joseph Levinson says about the Chinese at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, where there's this psychological, like a sour grapes phenomenon, like where they try to formulate, oh well, really we're different. Like our culture is superior, but we can change everything. Like there's like a what they call backfilling self-justification for how they are. That's very interesting. I don't have much more to. I just have to look into it more, but I think it's definitely there. The question for me is always how far back I go, because I keep wanting to go back farther and farther. This is how I ended up in the Ming. I didn't think I knew anything about the Ming. I was just going to do the Qing, and then I kept going back and back and back and back. And so I'm basically 16th, 17th century, and I expected to be well into the 19th century by now. It just hasn't. Thank you.
Any other questions? Discussion, rejections.
Yeah, rejection is fine too.
Arguments, hypotheses.
Just a small questions about the last map. Actually, who made this map?
It was a Qianwang era map, so it was whoever I could probably look up who the administrator was that commissioned it.
So it's made by the Jenco.
Yes, so I mean, they said it was on the basis of cadastral surveys. I mean, it was a geographically, it was meant to be accurate. Map.
Was in upper part of the map looks like a Qing landscape.
It looks like
a Qing landscape, kind of liberal taste on this map.
So this is something I have yet to read more about. So the last of these, or the second to last of these maps, there were 4 maps produced, and one of them has lots of writing. That one that I showed has lots of writing about Taiwan on it, but I don't know. I don't know what it says. But it's worth looking into because it gives the reason. I know that part of it, based on scholarship that's been done, gives reasons for why they had to why they had to produce the map, which is because they were having more and more settlement disputes between indigenous peoples and Han peoples. And so that was how they decided, well, we should just keep pushing it back to try to leave more space between the Han settlers and the border itself. But whether or not it says something about culture, like about the things I'm interested in, I don't know. So I should probably, that particular map is in Beijing.
Yeah.
And it's 7 meters long. Yeah, it's 7 meters. That's like a tiny corner of it. Yeah. When I saw that, I was like, 7 meters? You mean 7 centimeters? No, 7 meters. It's huge. It's huge.
Maybe like Emperor Tianlu, like the large map.
Well, I think like it would be rolled up, right? And then you could you could have it on a table like this, and both sides would be rolled up, and you would like kind of roll it and roll it, right? You wouldn't actually have to have a 7 meter long table. Sorry?
It's a scroll.
It's a scroll, yeah, exactly. But I think it was my understanding, and people who know about maps should correct me if I'm wrong, but they didn't just look at the whole, it wasn't like a map that was put up on a wall, it was rather used for reference where it would like sort of move with them, they would unroll part of it, and then they'd roll up the other part, so you didn't have to have the whole map out.
It's interesting to see the border on this map. Actually, do you know what kind of evidence, like the painter or artisan drew this border according to what, like how could the painter decide which part is the so-called barbarian community, which side is civilized people? How did they decide this?
This is a very good question. I actually don't know. I'm so text focused that I forgot there was an image there, even on the. It's funny. So my partner's a bit this way as well. So he's also a paleographer. He was a paleographer. We were at a museum once, and we were looking at actually an ancient Indian sculpture, and they were just talking about the sculpture, like the position that the person's arms were in, what this person, it was like I don't think it was a Buddha, it was something else, it was some kind of representational figure. And he's like, what about the text? And I was like, I didn't even notice this yet. Like on one side of it, there was this like paragraph of text in Sanskrit. He's like, they don't even talk about the text. What about the text? And so I'm always like, what about the text? But then obviously there's this like big image that's in front of me. And I'm like, hey, we should probably say something about this. But I fear I don't have the expertise to do it. But is there a literature? I mean, I imagine there's literatures about Chinese map making that would help me figure this out, isn't it? If I put the map back up, would you want to see it again? Would it help you to see the image again?
Yeah, because I thought maybe like there is a connection between the mountain and local like Taiwan people.
Okay, let me see if I can get it up again. No, it's plugged into the slideshow, but I don't know how to turn the projector on.
It just goes on.
Oh, but once it has input, it'll turn on.
Usually it doesn't.
Oh, that's very high tech.
Well, it's high tech, but you need to have patience. Sometimes I'm very impatient.
There it is, okay.
Can you help us read the map? Or do all of you understand that this is Taiwan? I certainly don't. But maybe I'm just.
It's Zhonghua in Taiwan, the northern.
Yeah, but I mean, so okay. This.
What's this? Which part of Taiwan?
Exactly.
And
So it's not the entire.
northern coast, well,
Okay.
sort of towards the northern coast. But I can't, so
Do you have, I mean, is this part of a complete map where you can see that it's an insert form? That's all.
yeah, no, it's part of a complete map. Like I said, it's 7 meters long, so I couldn't
All right.
reproduce the whole map. But,
Okay.
And I'm not an expert. I mean, this is actually a very good article that was recently published like a few months ago in East Asian history, talking about one of the cadastral surveys, and it reproduced this map. But that was the best image of it I could find. So that's the other thing, is I don't know if I'm even allowed to reproduce this image because it's part of the Palace Museum in Beijing. But if there's anything about it that you find important or interesting, please let me know because I need to learn. represented these little houses. Those are Han settlements. And I know about like, the line, that's the indigenous, that's the...
And what is visually interesting is that you have to turn a map if you want to read or understand the upper part over there, because it's not written just in one direction, but...
Yeah, and I think the whole map itself is oriented with east being north. Or sorry, east being on top.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So the map itself is, but I haven't seen it. I haven't seen the actual map. I've only seen images online.
No, wait, east, north, west.
Because if you see like the text, it changes. It's.
I just found an article about it. If you guys are interested, I can send it around. It's exactly about that map and the border.
Yeah, it might be that might be the source I'm talking about. Sorry about this.
All right.
The map from, is it by Qing
Leigh.
Yu, I think. Yeah, I think that, yeah, from Seneca, from First Map.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Okay.
And so maybe send it to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. I mean, honestly, if there's
There's
anything
a
you
question, of course.
let me know. Yeah.
Can I ask?
Yes, you are welcome. Yes.
So it's
And
just
then
a
we'll
clarification question. I was wondering what exactly did those colonializing practices involve? For example, does it involve the spread of language? Does it involve the extinction of local culture as we usually see in the European case?
Yeah.
Does it involve violence? Can we really subject these kind of practices to the same criticisms that we apply to the European colonizers, for example?
So a huge contingent of Qing historians think that yes, you can. A huge contingent of them assume that the practices are the same. That we can call this colonialism because it acts in a lot of the same ways. So partly what I'm saying is that we need to understand it in some terms to begin with. But in practice, it involved especially the establishment of local schools for the teaching of, well, it would have been, language is a bit of a different question in late imperial China because you didn't have a unified language on the mainland, you had a unified written language. So for the teaching of unified written language, and a lot of the success of a civilizing project would be how many degree holders that region produced. So, and they didn't produce many, but the idea would be, in principle, that if enough indigenous people went to these schools and enough people eventually became literate enough to read the Chinese classics, that this would have a trickle-down effect. But it did involve, I mean, in the case of these Han indigenous incursions, these scuffles on the frontier, it did involve violence in the sense of the Qing sending troops in to kill bandits, basically, and to restore order. So these people were not seen as civilized, right? In a perfect world, a measure of its success would be that you wouldn't have to have this because everybody would be living in according with certain kinds of ritual behavior. There's also economic arguments about tax farming and how the Qing managed its administration on the island. And there's arguments that this is similar to the way in which, for example, the British managed India. I don't go as much into that. I don't know as much about economic or fiscal policy, monetary policy. There's also economic parallels there.
Is there maybe a systematic difference of how Chinese historians and across the Qing dynasty and how Western historians of the Qing dynasty assess this colonialism?
There's a huge controversy that is raging on the internet and in scholarly journals. It's been raging for about 20 years now. The debate was, I think, started by it's actually at the AES every year they elect a president. The Association for Asian Studies, they elect a president. The president makes a speech. And I think it was Evelyn Roski that year who was elected president, and she made this was 20 years ago or so, 25 years ago. She made a speech called Re-envisioning the Qing, where she raised the idea that the Qing could be understood as an empire in the European sense of the term, that it had similar administrative and fiscal structures to an empire, and that the use of Manchu language materials was of huge importance in understanding the Qing, not just as another Chinese empire, but as actually a Qing empire that exceeded that of the Chinese state. And this was hugely controversial for some people, and there was a response published by a historian named He Ping Di in English in the Journal of Asian Studies, who tried to refute her historical points by saying actually the Qing was a peaceful state, it was a Sinicized state, and the way in which the Qing carried out its business and the way historically Chinese empires have carried out their business was nonviolent and through cultural acculturation, like cultural transformation. Now, the debate has gone on and on and on and on for the last 25 years. There are people who continue to claim, there are Chinese historians who continue to claim that there was no such thing as violence on the frontiers, and it was all a spontaneous process of acculturation. Those people are actually not. I mean, it's probably on the internet, but you can find anyone on the internet these days. Most Chinese historians would agree that there was violence, but they think that it was a form of state building. It did not meaningfully reflect the processes of European-style imperialism, because to most Chinese historians, imperialism is identified with capitalist, late modern expansionism. So the Leninist definition of imperialism, because that is indeed how it entered the Chinese lexicon in it was like really early 20th century, where you get this word 帝国主义, this idea of imperialism as an ism. Okay? Now, this is a disagreement, perhaps, about how we label empirical historical reality, but it also tells us something really interesting about how words change and move as they go from one place to another. Those of you in transcultural studies know all about this, right? I think I mentioned in the first lecture in response to a question, I'm actually writing a paper about this very topic, a separate paper with a colleague of mine. And the more we look into this, the more we're confused about. It gets very confusing with the way people use terminology. So our basic conclusion is that it's not that the Chinese historians are wrong for not seeing imperialism in the past, and it's not that the new Qing historians, the main historians who talk about, the Western historians who talk about the Qing in terms of imperialism, it's not that they're both right or they're both wrong, but they're both looking at separate kinds of agendas. And I'm not sure, I don't know what is gained. I don't know that there's a lot of disagreement about what went on in history. There's more disagreement about how we label what went on in history, if that makes sense. So it's actually quite controversial to call the Qing colonial or imperial. Controversial among Chinese historians. Among Western historians, it's not controversial. It's been going on for a while.
Yeah, but by that Marxist definition, the Qing dynasty or the Han dynasty might not be an empire. I mean, if it requires to be capitalist, then it's...
Right, yeah, that's exactly what they're saying. They're saying there was no imperialism because imperialism is associated with a certain kind of capital formation, with a certain kind of economic stage that is modern, right? And you have the British Empire as a modern capitalist enterprise. It's imperial in that meaningful sense. So if you define empire in that way, then it's going to be very hard to see something like the Han Dynasty as an empire. But you know what? The word empire was not applied to the Spanish or Portuguese of the New World either by themselves. They saw it as a form of conquest. They weren't speaking in terms of empire. So it's anachronistic even to talk about early modern European empires in terms of empire, because this was a term that became in wide use to identify expansionist, territorial, like land grabbing for the purposes of resource extraction. That didn't come into being until like the 18th and 19th century anyway in Europe. So it's actually a lot more complicated than you think. Like, it's not self-evident what an empire is. I thought it was. I honestly did before I started this project. I was like, well, we can just define empire. Now, one other thing I'll say about this, as we do our scholarship, as you were all interested in probably producing knowledge and not just being consumers of it, right? You're going to find it's quite difficult when you actually start to defend ideas that you have to come up with a definition and defend it somewhere. The people that call the Qing imperial, and some people also call the Han imperial. They use this term empire.
I was just surprised with it.
Well, okay, so there's a couple different things going on. One of the things going on is since I believe the 16th century, 17th century in Europe, it became conventional to call the Chinese state an empire. But the way they used this word empire was the same way they used the word empire to apply to themselves. It just meant a very, very large, powerful state, governing multiple territories, basically. So it becomes conventional in English, and I don't know, I imagine in other languages, in Latin certainly, to call the Chinese an empire. But that's different from saying it was imperial or colonial in the new Qing history sense. Okay. The controversy comes in when you call it imperial and they were trying to annex land, people, and territory and infiltrate them in violent ways to make them into Chinese. Like that's the imperial part that Chinese historians take offense to, because they say that's a modern formation, it's a modern capital formation. So that there's just different flavors, I guess is what, like it's difficult because there's that word empire that conflicts us. But what they'll say is, it doesn't matter if the people themselves are talking in these terms. We can still use these ideas to apply to historical actors, even if they never knew these terms existed, right? We use the word culture all the time, but that was also, the way we understand culture is, again, probably a late modern formation as tied to these quantitative social science practices like anthropology, right? I mean, but we still use it. We say that it can apply to the Romans or the Greeks, right? In some ways, that is the practice of social science. We invent categories and we apply them elsewhere as a way of understanding what's going on. It's unavoidable. So that's what the new Qing historians would say. Well, you have to apply categorization.